6 weeks ago, my 8-year-old daughter stood beside me at the Port Canaveral cruise terminal, clutching a blue passport holder so tightly that the plastic edge left a red line across her thumb. Lucy had been talking about that trip for weeks. She had made a little cruise journal with blank pages for dolphins, sea turtles, sunsets, and every meal she planned to rate with stars. But when the woman behind the counter searched the reservation, her polite smile disappeared. She checked Lucy's passport again, typed her name a second time, then looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Miss Ellis. I don't have a Lucy Ellis on this booking." Before I could make sense of that, I learned my parents had already boarded with my sister's 2 children. My mother wasn't surprised when I called. A few minutes later, she sent me a text that said, "They deserve this more." I didn't beg her to fix it. I didn't chase anyone through the terminal. And before that ship left port, I made one phone call that my father would spend the second night of his cruise desperately trying to undo. Before I tell you what that call uncovered, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what looked like one cruel family vacation turned out to be something my parents had been hiding for years. And if you enjoy stories about family secrets, consequences, and people finally drawing the line, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. That Thursday had started with Lucy so excited that she was dressed before I finished my first cup of coffee. We lived in the Orlando area, so Port Canaveral was only about an hour away, and I had deliberately left enough time for traffic and check-in. My mother, Susan, had organized the trip and had forwarded me what she called the family itinerary weeks earlier. I had glanced through it, confirmed the dates, checked Lucy's passport twice, and assumed the rest was handled because my parents had arranged several family outings before. Looking back, that assumption bothers me, but not because I think I should have predicted what they were doing. It bothers me because I had spent years treating my parents' favoritism like background noise. I had learned to absorb it so efficiently that I sometimes failed to notice when the same pattern was moving toward my daughter. At the counter, I pulled up the itinerary Susan had sent me. The employee studied it, then explained carefully that what I had was a general trip schedule, not an individual boarding confirmation. There was no cabin assignment for Lucy, no passenger record under her name, nothing she could use to check my daughter in. Lucy looked up at me and whispered, "Maybe Grandma put my middle name wrong." I told her that could be possible because, at that moment, I still wanted the answer to be something boring, a typo, a computer problem. Anything that could be corrected without forcing an 8-year-old to understand that 4 people she loved had boarded a ship knowing she wasn't coming. I called my mother. The background noise told me immediately that she was already on board, and when I asked where she was, she said she and Dad had gotten settled with Mia and Noah around noon. Mia was 10, Noah was 7, and they were my younger sister Jessica's children. I didn't waste time asking why they had arrived so early or why nobody had waited for us. I asked the only question that mattered. When did you remove Lucy? There was a pause long enough to answer me before Susan finally said, "Morgan, plans changed." I asked when. She told me not to make a scene, as though standing in a cruise terminal with a child who had been secretly excluded was somehow a scene I had created. Then she started explaining. Jessica had been through a difficult few years after her divorce. Mia and Noah didn't get the opportunities Lucy did. I had a good job, a stable home, and Susan said my daughter already had so much. The language was familiar because I had heard versions of it my entire life. Jessica needed help because I could manage. Jessica needed money because I could earn my own. Jessica needed Mom because I was strong. Now that logic had become, Mia and Noah need this more. I didn't argue about who had suffered more, because I had Lucy standing beside me listening to half of the conversation. I simply asked why Susan had let an 8-year-old pack a suitcase and drive all the way to the port if she already knew there was no reservation for her. My mother had no answer that made sense. I ended the call and walked Lucy away from the counter before she could hear anything else. We found a quieter area near the exit, and she stared down at the little cruise journal sticking out of her backpack. "Did I do something bad?" she asked me. That question cut through whatever anger I had been holding back. I crouched in front of her and told her no, absolutely not, and that adults sometimes made bad decisions that had nothing to do with whether a child deserved something. My phone buzzed before I stood up. Susan had sent one sentence. "They deserve this more." I read it twice, took a screenshot, and did not respond. I could have called her back and screamed. A younger version of me might have spent an hour trying to make my mother admit that what she had done was cruel. But at 39, I had finally learned something useful about Susan Ellis. Arguing with her about fairness usually gave her more room to redefine fairness. So I took Lucy to the car, turned on the air conditioning against the July heat, handed her some water, and started checking my email. My first thought was practical. If Susan had canceled Lucy's reservation, maybe there was a cancellation notice, refund confirmation, or booking change I had missed. I searched Lucy's name, the cruise dates, my mother's email address, and every travel-related subject line I could think of. That was when I saw the message from Atlantic Fiduciary Services. It had arrived several days earlier, and I had barely registered it at the time because I recognized the trust company and assumed it related to the trip Susan had already told us about. My late grandmother, Evelyn Mercer, had established a family trust for her 3 great-grandchildren years earlier. Lucy had her own accounting share. And because she was a minor, I received notices whenever a distribution was charged against it. I didn't control the trust, and I normally saw only a short description unless there was a reason to request more detail. The subject line of that notice read, "Distribution Notification." The description underneath was what made me sit completely still. Marine Youth Enrichment Travel, Lucy Ellis. I looked over at my daughter. She was sitting in the passenger seat holding the same passport holder she had carried into the terminal. Lucy was not on that ship. She wasn't registered to board it. Yet money from a trust share specifically associated with her had apparently been used for something called Marine Youth Enrichment Travel. I didn't know whether I was looking at a clerical mistake, a reimbursement filed under the wrong child, or something worse. What I did know was that I suddenly had 2 facts that could not both be innocent. My mother had deliberately excluded Lucy, and a financial record still claimed Lucy was receiving part of the benefit. It was a little before 2 in the afternoon when I called Atlantic Fiduciary Services. I reached Elaine Foster, the trust officer whose name appeared on several annual notices I had received over the years. I was careful with my words because I didn't want to make an accusation I couldn't prove. I told her there was a travel distribution charged to Lucy's share. I told her Lucy was physically sitting beside me at Port Canaveral. Then I told her there was no cruise booking under my daughter's name. Elaine asked me to repeat that last part, then verified my identity and explained that, as Lucy's designated parent notice recipient, I could dispute a transaction involving her share. I never used the word fraud. Elaine didn't either. She opened what she called a discrepancy case and told me she would request the supporting documents connected to that reimbursement. Because Susan and Raymond were the family reimbursement coordinators who submitted expenses for the grandchildren, Elaine said new reimbursement requests through their coordinator authority would be temporarily suspended while the initial discrepancy was checked. She made it clear that nothing was being taken back that afternoon, nobody was being accused of a crime, and the cruise itself had nothing to do with what her office could control. That was fine with me. I wasn't trying to stop a ship. I wanted to know why my daughter's name was attached to a benefit she had never received. Lucy and I were already heading back toward Orlando when the ship eventually left Port Canaveral around 4. I didn't stand at the water watching it disappear, and I didn't spend the drive imagining my parents panicking on board. I took Lucy home, unpacked the things she needed, ordered dinner, and tried to give her an evening that wasn't entirely defined by what her grandparents had done. Later, Elaine emailed me a case number and one simple question: whether I remembered any other travel or enrichment distributions in Lucy's name that I didn't recognize. I opened the old annual summaries I had saved and began going through them more carefully than I ever had before. Most of the descriptions were vague enough that I couldn't immediately tell what they represented. Science enrichment, educational technology, youth programming. Then I reached one line that made me stop scrolling. It said music instruction. Lucy had taken exactly 2 trial piano lessons in her life, at a studio I had chosen and paid for myself. There had never been a trust reimbursement for them because I had never requested one. Until that night, I had believed the cruise was the first time my parents had decided another child deserved something more than mine. Looking at that second transaction, I began to understand that I might have been asking the wrong question entirely. The next morning, Lucy's suitcase was still sitting beside the front door, exactly where I had left it. She had unzipped the top pocket to take out her pajamas, but everything else was untouched, including the little cruise journal she had decorated with blue waves and tiny stickers.
Dinner.
And
every time he offered to help, Rachel,
on 3
his younger
different
sister,
minutes
would deflect with phrases like,
Every
"Don't
time
worry,
Jordan
Mom's
moved,
got it."
I realized
Or, "We're
then
trying
that
to
my
keep it
parents
small."
had not
He
panicked
chalked it
at
up
the
to wedding
diagnosis.
stress.
They
He
had
told
planned
himself
for it.
not to
They
take
had
it
a script
personally,
ready before
but
Granny
now,
moved in.
seeing it in
They had
writing
told the
final,
hospice staff their version of
unapologetic,
me long
something
before the
inside
first
him
opioid
shifted.
was prescribed.
Ethan didn't respond.
I drove home
He didn't
that
ask
night
why.
and cried in the bathtub.
He didn't
That
demand an
morning, I
explanation.
received an email from a
Instead, he
lady
stood up,
confirming that
wa-
Atlantic Fiduciary Services had requested supporting documentation from my parents for the disputed cruise reimbursement. There was no dramatic language, no accusation, just a case number and a notice that the transaction was under review. I went to the small filing cabinet in my home office and pulled out the folder where I kept Lucy's trust notices. Most of what I had received over the years had been annual summaries, not detailed invoices, which was why the descriptions had never meant much to me before. Tucked behind one of those summaries was an old birthday card from my grandmother Evelyn. She had written it for Lucy when Lucy was still too young to read it herself, and I had saved it in the same folder because Evelyn had mentioned the trust in the note. In her careful handwriting she had written, "What is yours should always remain yours until you choose to give it." I remember reading that sentence again that morning and thinking it sounded almost embarrassingly simple. I put the card back and kept looking for dates. At the time, I had no idea how much that sentence would matter to me later. Susan called before lunch. The connection cut in and out because she was calling through the ship's Wi-Fi, but her tone came through perfectly. She told me I had misunderstood the situation, that the cabin arrangements had changed, and that taking 3 children would have made everything more expensive. Then she returned to the explanation she had already given me. Mia and Noah had been through more. Jessica's divorce had been hard on them. Lucy had a stable home, better opportunities, and a mother who could afford to take her places. I let her talk until she finally paused, then asked the question she had avoided at the terminal. "If this was about space and money, why didn't you tell me 2 weeks ago?" Susan said. "Because you would have made this difficult." I wrote those words down immediately. She had just admitted that keeping me uninformed had been part of the plan. Then Susan tried to solve the problem the way she always did when she wanted the discussion to end without changing anything. She said she and Dad could take Lucy somewhere special later, just the 3 of them.
I know
as though
exactly what
exclusion could be
1.5
repaired by
milligrams per
scheduling
hour
another
of
trip.
morphine
I
does to
told
an
her this was no
82-year-old
longer
woman in
about
post-op
replacing
day
the
2.
cruise. There was a
I looked
financial
at the
record
IV
in
pump.
Lucy's name for a
I looked
benefit
at
she had
Brenda.
not received.
Brenda
and the trust
looked
company
at the
was
IV
reviewing
pump.
it.
I said
Susan went quiet
quietly,
for several
"The way you
seconds.
talk in a room with a
When she
sleeping
spoke again,
patient."
she asked why
Brenda,
I had involved
she's on a
outsiders in a family
1.5
matter.
milligram morphine drip.
I reminded her
You
that
can't
the trust
notarize
company
this.
managed the money.
You know you can't.
They were not outsiders.
Right away.
My father
Ethan
and
just sat there for a while, phone face down on the table, letting the silence in his apartment stretch as far as it needed to.
My Aunt
The
Carol
stillness
texted me
wasn't
saying
uncomfortable.
Mom had told
He
her
was
Mama
used
would
to
be
it.
so
He
proud
had
of
lived
her
most of his
vacation.
life
She
in
let
that
everyone
same
on the street
quiet
for
space
10
emotionally.
Mia and Noah.
At least
did not
even
have
when the
no
rooms
interest
around
in
him were
conducting
full
a
of
family
people who
trial
shared
by
his
group
last name.
text. My father
That
looked at
message
the
from his
window.
dad was a
Lucy
ripple,
had
Then Annabelle
but
played
not yet a
Valorant.
wave.
And that a
Not
financial
yet.
My
record
grandmother's
connected
voice
Ethan
came
had
out of the
learned
conference
early
room
that
speakers
that
or
being
filled the
quiet
room
was
the way it could
easier
fill
than
the
being
dining.
That was all I said. I did not send the screenshot of Susan's message. I did not send a picture of Lucy crying. I wasn't going to turn my daughter's worst afternoon into evidence for a family audience that had already decided it wanted a simpler story. Friday evening, I was sitting on Lucy's bed reading with her when my phone started vibrating on the nightstand. Raymond. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, he called again. Then again. I didn't listen until Lucy was asleep.
She did not
The first
ask how
message
I was.
controlled.
She said,
"Morgan, call
"Lily,
me.
you embarrassed
Whatever you
Mom in
told the
front of a
trust
hospital
office,
nurse.
we need to straighten
She'll
this
never
out."
forgive you.
The
Just
second was
stay
sharper.
away.
They
It's better for
suspended
everyone."
reimbursements. Do you understand
I did
what
not
that
call
means?
my sister again for
By the
26
voicemail,
months.
He had
In the
stopped
summer of
pretending he was calm.
2024, Cassandra
What did
texted
you
me
do?
from a coffee shop in
Call me
Greer.
before this
"Lily,
gets worse. It was
Granny
the
moved
second
into
night of
Mom
their
and Dad's
cruise.
house last week.
Exactly one day
They're
after
saying
I
it's
had
just
made that
until she
call
gets
from the
stronger.
parking lot. And my
She's
father
not
was
going
agreed
back
you're
to
not
chapters.
welcome.
about Lucy than he did about what someone might find in a file. I called him back from my kitchen. He answered immediately. I told him I had disputed one transaction because Lucy was listed as receiving something she had not received. He said I was jeopardizing money that was supposed to help all 3 children. That wording caught my attention. My father had spent years telling me that Susan handled the family details. especially anything involving gifts or activities for the grandkids. Yet now he was talking about
I packed my evidence
It's
not healthy.
Coordinator.
I remember
drove
the
the temperature of
135 miles.
I
remember
documents
Granny
did
in the
not
doorway
relate
with
to
a
him.
ham platter. From the parking
He knew
lot,
the
not
process
looking at
much
her
better
daughter,
than I had
I
expected.
not looking at me.
I asked him,
walking
almost
past
what
time,
exactly
the platter
are you
to
afraid
Lily
of
as
here
if
too?
the room had been
She
silent.
wrote back. Told me not to be
See,
dramatic.
she knew.
Vamos.
That was when I
She
realized
had
I
known.
did not
At
answer the
8:58, I
question.
walked into
In
Sterling Hall
2009,
my
room
grandfather
3
Henry
ledger
died of
for
complications. My
Lucy's
sister
house.
was
From
already
Agent
at Orange
because I was
Exposure.
Lucy's
Family at the
designee,
VA
I had
had spent
spent
35
I was
years.
in
The
arguing
committee
about
was
the
assembling
transaction
on the
list
other.
connected to her share, though not every underlying document yet. I opened it at my dining room table with a notebook beside me. The descriptions were vague. Science enrichment, music instruction, educational technology, temporary educational housing support. Some I vaguely recognized. Others meant nothing to me. I resisted the urge to assume every unfamiliar line was fraudulent. I started with dates. One entry for a science enrichment camp caught my attention because the week looked familiar. I pulled up my calendar, then I checked my email for hotel confirmations. Finally, I opened a folder of photos from a wedding Lucy and I had attended in Colorado. The dates matched exactly. I had pictures of Lucy standing beside me at the reception, wearing a yellow dress, 3 states away from Florida. On the same days, the trust ledger said money had been spent for her science camp. I checked the dates one more time because I wanted to be wrong. I wasn't. Lucy couldn't have been at that camp. She wasn't even in Florida. By Saturday morning, I stopped looking at the ledger like a list and started treating it like a timeline. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and made 4 columns: date, description, amount, and where Lucy actually was. The science camp was the first entry I could disprove cleanly. I attached the hotel confirmation from Colorado, the wedding invitation, and dated photos showing Lucy beside me throughout the week. Then I sent only those facts to Elaine. I did not write that my parents had stolen from my daughter. I did not tell her what I suspected. I wrote that Lucy could not have received the stated benefit because she was physically out of state. Elaine replied that the discrepancy was enough to expand the review, but she was careful to add that one mismatched transaction did not establish intent. That was exactly the kind of answer I wanted. If something was wrong, I wanted it proved properly. Once the dispute was expanded, Elaine was able to send me supporting documents directly related to the charges against Lucy's share. The first one was for music instruction. The invoice came from a studio near Jessica's neighborhood. Lucy had never attended it. Her only experience with piano had been 2 trial lessons at another studio, and I had paid for both with my own card. I checked the dates, checked the location, then wrote it down instead of jumping ahead. I had already learned that assumptions were useless if I couldn't separate what I knew from what I only believed. The educational technology charge was harder. The invoice listed a laptop model and a serial number, and for a few minutes I stared at it without understanding why the model sounded familiar. Then, I remembered Christmas. Jessica had posted a picture of Noah sitting on her living room floor with wrapping paper around him and a new laptop balanced on his knees. I found the photo on my phone because she had sent it to our family group chat. The model looked identical. That still was not proof, so I called Jessica. I did not pretend the call was casual. The trust company is reviewing an invoice charged to Lucy's share, I told her. It's for a laptop. The model looks like Noah's. Jessica went silent, then immediately became defensive. She said Mom and Dad had bought Noah that computer for school and asked whether I was seriously going to start inventorying her children's belongings. I said no. I asked for the serial number. She accused me of treating her like a criminal. I told her if the number did not match, I would cross it off my list and move on. That seemed to matter to her. A few minutes later, she texted me a photo of the label on the bottom of Noah's laptop. The serial number matched the invoice exactly. I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen for a long time. The laptop was real. Noah had it. The trust record said Lucy's share had paid for educational technology. I forwarded both the invoice and Jessica's photo to Elaine. Then I called Jessica again. She answered angry. I told you I thought Mom and Dad bought it. I heard you. So what are you accusing me of? I'm asking whether you signed anything connected to it. There was a pause that changed the tone of the whole conversation. Jessica finally said, Dad sent forms sometimes. What forms? I don't know, routine things, acknowledgements. He said they were for the kids. Did you read them? Another pause. Not every line. That answer hit me harder than I expected. I had spent years watching Jessica accept help without asking many questions, and I could already feel my mind arranging the evidence into the version that fit my oldest resentment. Jessica had received the laptop. Jessica had signed forms. Jessica had spent most of our adult lives being rescued. It was easy to decide she had known exactly what was happening. When Elaine sent the acknowledgement documents later that afternoon, I found what I expected to find. Several forms carried Jessica's electronic signature beside a line, identifying her as the parent confirming receipt of an educational benefit. The charge allocation beneath the form tied the expense to Lucy's accounting share. I barely noticed anything else. All I saw was Jessica's name. I called her immediately. You signed for money taken from Lucy. That is not what I signed. Your name is on the form. My name is on a lot of forms Dad sends me. You expect me to believe you never looked at who was paying? I expect you to believe I didn't know they were using Lucy's share. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. You always knew when Mom and Dad were helping you. That doesn't mean I knew where every dollar came from. That's convenient. She snapped that I had spent my whole life assuming the worst about her because she needed help more often than I did. I told her this was not about who needed help. It was about using my daughter's money and signing paperwork connected to it. Jessica kept insisting that Raymond sent the forms and called them routine. I didn't want to hear it. In that moment, I thought I had found the person behind the whole thing, and the fact that I had years of resentment ready to support that conclusion made it feel even more certain. I did not realize Lucy had come down the hallway until she was standing near the kitchen doorway. She had heard enough. Does Aunt Jessica hate me too? She asked. The question stopped me cold. I turned away from the phone and knelt beside her. No. I shouldn't have said what I said like I knew everything. I don't. But you said she knew. I said that before I had all the facts. Lucy looked worried in a way that had nothing to do with money. Can I still talk to Mia? Of course, Mia didn't do anything. I ended the call with Jessica soon after that, and for the first time since the cruise, I felt ashamed of something I had done. Not because Jessica was necessarily innocent, but because I had let an old family pattern make my decision for me. I had spent years believing Jessica benefited because she knew how to get what she wanted from our parents. Maybe that was partly true, but partly true was not enough for what I had just accused her of. That evening, I opened the acknowledgement forms again and read every line slowly. This time I noticed the metadata. The forms with Jessica's electronic signature had not originated from her account. They had been created and sent from the Family Reimbursement Coordinator portal. I clicked through the details on the oldest
Then I
flagged
noticed the
file.
woman
Created
standing
by
2 feet
coordinator.
behind Patty.
Submission initiated
Light
by
blue
coordinator.
scrubs.
Account name.
Name tag Brenda
Raymond
Markham,
Ellis.
RN.
I checked the next form.
I
Zoom
didn't
account.
recognize her from
Then the
this
next
floor.
one.
She
Raymond.
wasn't a circulating
For
nurse.
most of my life,
She
my
wasn't
father
a
had
charge
played the
nurse,
role of the
but
reasonable
she had a
one.
notary stamp in her
Mom
hand.
handled the emotions.
A lot of South
Mom made the
Carolina
decisions.
nurses pick
Mom
up a
got
notary
involved.
commission for
Dad stayed out
$50
of
of
it.
side income.
That was the story he preferred.
Patty had
And
clearly
until that
arranged it
moment,
ahead of
I had
time.
mostly accepted
She had
it.
been waiting
But
for the
those
morphine.
forms had not started with Jessica. They had started with him. Jessica and I met 2 days later at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, without any of the kids. I chose a table near the back because I did not want Mia, Noah, or Lucy becoming part of an adult argument they had not created. Jessica arrived 10 minutes late, dropped her purse into the chair beside her, and looked at me like she had already been defending herself in her head for the entire drive. I didn't start with the laptop. I didn't start with Mom. I put a printed copy of one of the acknowledgement forms between us and pointed to her electronic signature. Tell me exactly what you thought you were signing. She stared at it for several seconds before admitting that Dad had sent her links from time to time and told her they were routine paperwork connected to activities, school expenses, or things he and Mom had already arranged for the kids. She said she usually opened the link on her phone, scrolled to the signature box, and signed. Did you ever read the beneficiary allocation? I asked. Jessica rubbed her thumb along the edge of her coffee cup. Not carefully. When I asked why, she gave me the answer I should have expected. Because every time I asked questions, Mom said it was handled. That isn't the same as not knowing, I said. Jessica's eyes narrowed. I didn't know they were using Lucy's money. I told her I believed that she might not have understood the entire system, but she had still made a choice not to look closely because the arrangement benefited her. She flinched at that, then accused me of enjoying the fact that she needed help. That was where the conversation stopped being about forms and became about the two roles we had been assigned our entire lives. Jessica said I had no idea what it was like to grow up next to someone who was always described as responsible, organized, capable. According to her, every mistake she made became another reason for Mom and Dad to step in, while every success of mine became proof that I didn't need anything from anyone. I told her being the capable one had never felt like winning.
60 years,
Your
your
sister
sister
will
will
be
be
dismissed
dismissed
from
from medical
faster,
school. There was the
complain
singer. She will
less,
never
and
become a
solve
doctor.
my
There was
own
the small
problems
cedar
quietly.
box. Is that what
When
Lily would
Jessica
want? She
lost a
called
job,
the
Lily
Mom
would
would
want
want
both
both
of
of
you
She
to
never
be
let me
doctors.
open
When I
that
struggled
one.
after Lucy
Lily
was
would
born,
want
Mom
healing.
told
You'll
me I
know
had
what to
always
do with
been
the
good
important
under
parts
pressure.
when the time
Jessica
comes.
stared at me
Family
for a long
apart.
moment
By the
and said,
time I was
"Drop
a
the complaint.
teenager,
Being
I
the
had a
favorite was
private
easy.
theory that my
I
mother
shook
hated
my
this
head.
room. Your father
No.
Patty
agrees with
performed
me.
Christianity the way
Being
some
rescued
women perform
every
yoga.
time taught
At
you that somebody
11:23,
else
when
is
the
right
father
close.
texted me
She
separately in front of
looked
the right
away.
people.
Neither of us apologized. I didn't want a dramatic reconciliation based on one difficult conversation, and I wasn't ready to pretend years of resentment had vanished because we finally named some of it. What mattered was that Jessica stopped trying to convince me she had been completely uninvolved. She admitted she had signed documents she had not read because trusting Mom and Dad was easier than asking questions that might have threatened the help she depended on. That evening, Mia called Lucy. Jessica texted first to ask whether it was okay, and I told her yes, as long as the girls were allowed to talk without adults feeding them answers. Lucy sat cross-legged on the couch with my phone on speaker while I folded laundry nearby. Mia sounded confused more than anything else. She asked why Lucy had decided not to come on the cruise. Lucy looked at me immediately. I said nothing because the answer needed to be hers. "I didn't decide that," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Mia said Grandma had told them Lucy changed her mind at the last minute and that maybe she was afraid of the ship. Lucy's face tightened. "I went to the port," she said. "They didn't have my name." Mia went quiet again, then said she was sorry. I didn't interrupt or turn the call into an interrogation. Mia was 10. She was not a witness I intended to squeeze for information. But hearing the story Susan had told, the children mattered in another way. She had not only excluded Lucy, she had rewritten the event so nobody on the ship would have to see what she had done. The next morning, Jessica called me before work. Her voice sounded different, less defensive. She had spent part of the night searching through old messages with Dad. She forwarded several screenshots. Most were ordinary reminders about appointments, school supplies, camp registrations, and things Mom had offered to pay for. Then I found one from the summer after Jessica's divorce. Raymond had written, "Just sign the summer forms. Mom handled the coding." Another message, sent after Jessica asked what one form was for, said, "Don't overthink it. It keeps everything moving." None of that proved Jessica knew Lucy's share was being charged, but it did confirm a pattern. Dad had been the person sending the forms, and he expected her to sign without asking much. Jessica had something else. Elaine had asked her to help identify a housing expense from several years earlier. So Jessica found the lease from the apartment she moved into after her divorce. She emailed me a copy after sending it to Elaine. Her name was on every page as the tenant. Mia and Noah were listed as occupants. Lucy's name appeared nowhere because Lucy had never lived there. The trust company had not originally seen that full lease. The reimbursement packet from back then contained only a move-in charges statement that did not clearly identify the tenant on the page used for the quick review. The full lease was being added now because the historical transaction had been flagged. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want to build a story where everyone had been stupid except me. If the original trustee had seen a lease boldly labeled Jessica Parker and still charged the expense to Lucy, then the entire system would have looked absurd. Instead, the problem was more believable and more unsettling. Someone had supplied just enough documentation to make the request look routine, then certified that the beneficiary was Lucy. Elaine called later that afternoon. She had reviewed the oldest transaction in the group they were examining. It was classified as temporary educational housing support connected to Lucy's share. The request had been initiated from Raymond's coordinator account. More importantly, Raymond had personally certified it. He had described the expense as necessary to maintain educational continuity and stable housing for the beneficiary. I read that line twice after Elaine sent me the record. Lucy had been 5 at the time. She had lived with me in the same home the entire year. There had been no housing emergency in her life. I remembered that period clearly because Jessica's divorce had been ugly financially, even if it had not turned into a courtroom spectacle. She had been scared she would lose her apartment after falling behind on move-in costs and deposits. Mom had called me then and asked whether I could help. I had told her I could contribute something small but not thousands. I was raising Lucy by myself and had just bought my townhouse. A week later, Dad told me not to worry because he and Mom had handled Jess's deposit from savings. I believed him. There had been no reason at the time to think otherwise. Now I knew at least part of that money had been charged to Lucy. Jessica called again after Elaine spoke to her too. I swear I thought they paid it themselves, she said. This time I did not accuse her of lying. I believed she had not understood the allocation. I also believed she had trained herself not to understand too much. Both things could be true. I was wrong when I called you the mastermind, I told her. The silence that followed was almost stranger than an argument. Then I added, that doesn't mean you did nothing wrong. Jessica said she knew. She admitted she had signed forms because the help felt necessary and because looking too closely might have forced her to refuse it. That was the first time she said the part out loud that I had been trying to make her see. I thought correcting my judgment about Jessica would make the picture simpler. It did the opposite. If she had not designed the system, then somebody else had, and the oldest request we had found did not point to Susan first. It pointed to Raymond, the man who had spent years acting as though family finances were mostly my mother's territory. Before we ended our call, Elaine told me Atlantic Fiduciary Services was expanding the review beyond the cruise, camp, laptop, and housing request. They would now examine historical distributions charged to Lucy's share and compare the certifications with the actual beneficiaries wherever the records allowed it. Her tone remained careful and professional, but the phrase she used stayed with me long after the call ended. This may be a pattern of beneficiary misallocation. By the time my parents came home from the cruise, the review had grown far beyond one disputed travel charge. Susan called me the morning after they returned and asked if I could come over so we could settle this privately. I knew what that meant before she explained it. She wanted to reimburse the amount connected to the cruise from her own account. Have me tell Atlantic Fiduciary Services that the issue had been resolved and let everyone move on. She kept calling it a misunderstanding. Even after the science camp, the laptop and the housing charge had already surfaced. We'll put the
But
cruise
where
on
all of
back,
the difference?
she said.
She said,
There's no
on the
reason to
evening
drag
of
the
April
whole
7th, the
family.
night
She said it
before
the
the
way she
hearing,
said
said everything
what
Juliet
she
called
meant to
me.
do about the
Slow. Her
camp.
voice
Lucy
was
never
brilliant
had
and
it.
practiced.
And
Once.
the laptop Noah had been
Elizabeth, she did not
using.
repeat herself.
And the
I will lose
apartment
everything.
opposite
You
had
weren't
been
paying
somehow
attention. I will lose
labeled as
Yale.
housing
The lesson
support
I will
daughter.
lose my future.
Susan
Over the
told
next
I am
20 years, she
was
walked
watching
me
through
through
what
what was in the
children
cedar
paperwork.
box on the
I
table.
told her I wasn't
and what
taking
would one
anything
day
from Mia
be.
or
You did
Noah.
not make us on the
I was
high
asking
shelf.
why
You wrote
adults had
5.
certified
There were
that Lucy
11
was
letters
theirs
my
and
grandfather
Susan
Henry
was
had
theirs.
written her. I unfolded
Then I
it.
said
Lily,
no to the
pencil,
private
call this
repayment.
woman. A child
That
holding the
refusal
hand
made
of
me
a woman.
unpopular
14
very
days
quickly.
I had not
My
been
Aunt
ready. Both of
Carol
them
called
looking
me
at each
later
other.
that
14
afternoon and
days
said
I had
Mom
been
had
on the
told
back
everyone
who
I
still
was
hoped
trying
her
to
mother
destroy
would
the
say
trust
something true.
because I was
For when you
jealous that
graduated, my mother
Jessica's
had just
kids would
answered
receive
the
more
question
help.
for age 9.
Another
I set
relative
the
sent
alarm.
me a
I
message
took a
reminding
photograph
me
of
that
it
I
where
owed
it
more
lay.
money than
Tomorrow I would
Jessica.
drive
I
100
asked her
miles
whether I
south
really
on
wanted to
I-26
put my
original
harder
in the
with
inner
children
pocket
who
on
had
Augusta
already
Road
been
in
through
Greenville.
enough.
I went downstairs.
I did not get
I would
paid
meet
to
a
go
woman.
there.
My grandmother had
That
been
was the
sitting
trap my
across
mother
from.
was in
Juliet
since I
had
was
been
16
notified
years
by the
old.
Yale Committee on
Turn every question about ownership into a debate about need. I replied with the same sentence each time. Who needs more is not the issue. A beneficiary certification has to be true. I did not send full records. I did not post screenshots, and I did not tell anyone what Elaine was still reviewing. My parents wanted the conversation to become emotional enough that facts stopped mattering. I had no intention of helping them do that. Raymond took a different approach. He called me that evening sounding almost calm, the way he always did when Susan was openly furious and he wanted to look like the reasonable one. He said the whole situation had been blown out of proportion and that I was reading family bookkeeping like it was a criminal scheme. Every dollar stayed in the family, he he told me. I asked him what that meant. He said he had always tried to keep things fair among the grandchildren, and that sometimes expenses had to be shifted depending on who needed what. The words were so casual that for a moment I wondered whether he realized what he had just
Marilyn,
done.
we all
Then,
agreed you're
he
not
said he
welcome
had
at
his
the
own
wedding.
spreadsheet.
3 days
No
later,
punctuation,
the hospice
no
coordinator
explanation.
from interim
I
health
Just that
care
smug
Sabrina
little
called
dash
me.
she
every
always
day.
Polite
used in place of a period.
Southern.
I asked him to
Ethan
careful.
stared at the
Ms.
message,
Slater,
unsure
your
if his
parents
eyes
have
were playing
indicated
tricks
that
on
the
him.
patient's
He read it
emotional
again.
stability.
Then
Certain
again.
family
The
members
words
should
didn't
not
change.
visit
It
unannounced.
wasn't entirely a
His
shock,
I'm so
though.
sorry.
The signs
This is
had
a
been there
family
subtle,
decision we have to
accumulating over
respect.
months.
File was
He
in
hadn't
I
been
sat
included in the
parking
group
lot of
photo
Walgreens
I did
planning,
not
with the
edit it
hadn't
or
received an
copy his
invite to the
speaker
engagement.
document. I saved the original file exactly as he sent it, then opened it. The first page looked harmless enough. Dates, abbreviated initials, short descriptions, reimbursement amounts. But the farther I went, the less harmless it became. There were columns marked L, M, and N. Lucy. Mia. Noah. Some rows matched things I already recognized from the trust ledger. Others contained notes in Raymond's shorthand. Shift to M. J. Emergency. I'm lessons. Then I found one row where the charge had been allocated to Lucy's share, but the note beside it said M lessons. A few rows later, next to another expense charged to Lucy, Raymond had written 3 words. L can absorb. I read them again. Il can absorb. For a second, I was no longer looking at a spreadsheet. I was hearing my mother tell me, when I was 23 and Jessica needed help with rent, "You'll be fine." I was remembering Christmases when Jessica got more because she had had a harder year. I was remembering how often my parents described me as capable, when what they really meant was convenient. Capable people could wait. Capable people could pay their own way. Capable people could lose something without making everyone uncomfortable. I had spent years treating that as an irritating family habit. Raymond's spreadsheet showed me something much worse. They had turned that
Or
habit
anything
into
else
life.
in your family's
I replied
possessions,
with
one
one
sentence.
sentence.
Anything physical.
I called
Actually
Jessica
connected
and
to
asked
call
if
grandma's
Dad
lawyer,
kept
and I knew
secrets.
the
She
answer.
really trusted.
She said
no.
I just did not
The
know
next
where
when
it
I
was.
read
It wasn't my
phrase,
lawyer who
L
called.
can
I called
absorb,
it was there
she
that
went
night.
quiet.
His
Then
voice,
she
I had
said,
not called her in
"That
4
sounds
months.
nice."
I
I asked
need to
what
stop
she meant.
nervous.
Jessica
Right the way
told
she
me Dad
always
had
picked
always
up when
talked
she did
about
not
they had won in
recognize
terms
the
of
number
who
on the
could
screen. They had
dream.
no idea
But
that every
when she was
cruel thing
struggling
they did
after
in
the
that
divorce,
Sophia,
he would say,
I had
had
been
more
watching
room
them.
in my
I need to
whole
ask you
stability,
something.
more options.
My name
Did
is
you
really
ever meet my
Slater.
mother? Never heard him
33.
apply that directly to Lucy, but she wasn't surprised by the logic. I did not tell her everything else in the spreadsheet. I was beginning to understand that I needed to stop using family conversations as my primary source of truth. I forwarded the original file to Elaine with a short note stating exactly how I had received it. Raymond sent it voluntarily after saying it proved the family allocations were fair. Elaine called me the next morning. She had received the spreadsheet and preserved the file metadata. She would not tell me what conclusion the trust office might reach, but she said several entries appeared to line up with the transactions already under review. She also reminded me that private notes by themselves did not establish the entire history. What mattered was whether the notes matched certifications and actual beneficiaries. I appreciated that she kept slowing me down whenever anger tried to race ahead of evidence. Then she told me something else. The oldest flagged transaction from 2023 had not been submitted only through the reimbursement portal. Raymond had emailed it directly to the shared trust administration address. I asked why that mattered. Because the archive submission includes the entire email as it was received, she said, including forwarded material. I sat straighter at my desk. What forwarded material? I can't characterize it for you yet. Counsel is reviewing what portions are part of the trust record and what may need redaction. I felt frustration rise immediately. So you can see it, but I can't? Not yet. And I don't want to imply what it means before that review is finished. That answer was careful, and I knew she was right to be careful. Still, the idea stayed with me. Raymond had sent the first housing reimbursement by email. Whatever he had forwarded with, it had been preserved inside the submission. For the first time, the review had a possible window into what my parents had been saying before they turned their decisions into official paperwork. Susan called again that afternoon and asked if I had come to my senses. She had apparently heard from Raymond that I refused to let the review end. I told her I was not discussing an off-the-books repayment. She said I was making everything harder than it needed to be. We can replace whatever amount you think Lucy lost. That phrase caught me. Whatever amount you think Lucy lost. Not whatever was filed incorrectly. Not whatever happened. She was still treating the money as mine to negotiate away. I told her, this isn't about whether you can write a check now. It's about whether you should ever have had the authority to make these decisions in the first place. Susan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Authority? Morgan, we were helping family. That's what you keep saying. Because it's true. Then let the record show that. She went silent. That silence told me more than another argument would have. Until then, part of me had still been thinking like someone trying to fix a bad transaction. Refund the cruise allocation. Correct the camp. Reimburse the laptop. Separate Lucy's share cleanly and move on. But Raymond's spreadsheet changed the shape of the problem. If L can absorb was not a one-time rationalization, but a standing principle, then returning one payment would solve nothing. The people making the decisions would still be the same people. The system would still be available to them. That evening, after Lucy went to bed, I opened the spreadsheet again and compared it line by line with the limited ledger Elaine had provided. I did not understand every abbreviation, but one pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Whenever Jessica had an emergency, or Mia and Noah had an expense my parents thought mattered more, Lucy's column seemed to become flexible. Not empty. Not protected. Flexible. That word bothered me more than the numbers. Elaine emailed me shortly before 9. She confirmed that the 2023 housing
through hospital
reimbursement
security
had been
under the
submitted
internal
by Raymond
volunteer
through the trust
coordination audit
administration
policy.
mailbox. Not
She had been at
uploaded
Boston
through the
Children's
portal.
24
The archived
years.
record contained
They
prior
trusted her.
messages that
The
had been
first
forwarded
file was my
into
patient
email.
navigator log.
Trust counsel was
3,200 total
intelligence.
hours
Your
across
battery
my
saves
caseload.
power.
But Elaine
And
wanted
updates
me
are
to know
automatic.
that the
1,180 of
original
those
message
hours were
interrupts you.
specifically with Lily
I called
Donovan
Dell
and her
Pro
mother.
So the
Bedside
early
reading,
messages still exist.
translation,
Yes.
family
Between
conferences,
who? I
hospice
can't answer
support.
that
We're
until we
Phoenix
review.
After hours
a
visits,
family-owned
I looked at the spreadsheet open on my screen, then at the row that said, L can absorb. For days, I had been asking which person had benefited, which form had been signed, which expense had been mislabeled. That night, a different question took over. What had my parents been saying to each other before they ever put Lucy's name on the paperwork? Elaine's final sentence before we ended the call stayed with me. The first request was submitted by your father in an email thread. The earlier messages were preserved with it. Elaine called me the following morning with enough information to reconstruct the first housing reimbursement more clearly. The original submission from 2023 had included 3 things: a move-in charges statement from Jessica's apartment complex, a certification signed by Raymond, and the email he had sent to the shared trust administration address. At the time, the move-in statement had looked generic enough to pass a routine review. It showed deposits and initial housing charges, but the copy attached to the reimbursement request.
Phone lit up again.
We're going to play
clearly
3
identified
message.
Jessica as the
Annabelle
tenant
said.
This
on the
time,
page the
it
trust
wasn't from
request
Marilyn.
used for
It
processing.
wasn't from
She started
Rachel.
critical
It
threes
wasn't even
my
from one
mother
of the
watched
cousins,
herself.
He had
who
described
likely
on a
had
wall
no
mounted
idea what
necessary
had just
to
happened.
strangers'
Educational
It was from his
continuity
father,
Slide her
and
Thomas
own
stable
Miller.
mother's
housing for the
engagement
You
benefit.
off
around?
her own
I think you
mother's
should
The
see
fingers.
beneficiary
something.
named in
The
the
Just
audio
that.
is perfectly
7
clear.
words.
Elaine
No
reminded
drama,
me that the full
no
amount
I'm just gonna
emotion.
look
Jessica
at
had
it.
recently
Just a
supplied
quiet
don't
flag in the
change
wind,
context completely.
signaling
mother
that
opened
whatever
her mouth.
Ethan had
That
assumed
loose
about the
shut
boundaries of
Jessica
this
Parker
family
That's edited.
fracture.
as the tenant and Mia and Noah as occupants. Lucy had never lived there, never attended school from that address, and never received the housing benefit Raymond had certified. Seeing the language on that old form pulled me straight back to the summer after Jessica's divorce. I remembered the phone calls, the panic, the constant fear that one missed payment would become something bigger. Jessica had been working, but legal expenses, deposits, moving costs, and inconsistent child support had hit her all at once. Susan called me one evening and asked if I could help cover part of Jessica's move-in money. I had just bought my townhouse. I was raising Lucy alone, and my savings were thinner than I liked to admit. I told Mom I could help with a smaller amount, but I could not write a check for several $1,000s. Susan sounded disappointed in a way that made me feel 12 years old again. A week later, Raymond told me not to worry because he and Mom had handled Jess's deposit from savings. I remembered feeling relieved. I had believed they stepped in because they could. I never asked to see proof because it never occurred to me that their solution had anything to do with Lucy. That memory bothered me more than the amount itself. I had spent years believing my parents had privately sacrificed for Jessica. That belief had shaped the way I saw all of us. Jessica was the child who needed rescuing. I was the one who did not. Susan was the mother who always found a way. Raymond was the father who quietly made the numbers work. Now, one old reimbursement form suggested that at least one of those rescues had been paid for by the grandchild they considered least in need. I could understand why helping Jessica had felt urgent. I could even understand panic. What I could not understand was the decision to solve one family member's crisis by quietly assigning the cost to another child. Jessica came to my house that evening after Mia and Noah were with their father. She looked exhausted before she even sat down. I showed her the housing certification Elaine had shared and asked if she remembered Dad ever telling her where the money came from. She shook her head. He said they had it handled. I reminded her that she had already admitted she avoided asking questions when the answers might make the help harder to accept. Jessica did not argue with me this time. She stared at the table and said, "I think I knew there were things I didn't want explained." That was more honest than anything she had said so far. She told me Mom and Dad had seemed tight on cash around that period. Raymond complained about insurance costs and repairs on the boat. Susan talked about cutting back. Jessica noticed those things. But when they suddenly had money for her deposit, she accepted the explanation that Dad had moved things around. "I liked believing they could always fix it," she said. "I know." She looked at me. "That doesn't make it okay." "No." For once, neither of us tried to soften the other person's responsibility. I told her fear could explain why she stopped asking questions, but fear did not turn Lucy's trust share into a family emergency fund. Jessica nodded. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Mom always made it sound like you had more room to lose things." I knew exactly what she meant. Better income, more stable home, fewer emergencies. More room. As if stability created an invisible cushion around me and Lucy that made taking from us less serious. After Jessica left, I opened the old trust folder again. I found one of the early summaries from when my grandmother Evelyn first established the trust. It was written in the dry language of accounting shares and beneficiary interests, but the structure was simple. Equal starting shares for Mia, Lucy, and Noah. Separate accounting. Separate benefit. Evelyn had not written some prophetic warning about my parents or predicted what would happen years later. She had simply made a choice that each child would have something of their own. That was when I remembered the birthday card again. What is yours should always remain yours until you choose to give it. When I had first reread that card, it felt sentimental. Now it felt almost painfully practical. My grandmother's idea of fairness had been simple enough for a child to understand. My parents had complicated it until they could call taking from one child an act of generosity toward another. I did not want another family theory. I wanted Raymond's answer. I called him that night. He picked up on the fourth ring and immediately sounded tired. "Morgan, I'm not doing this again. I'm not asking about the cruise." He exhaled. "Then what?" "Jessica's apartment." There was a pause. I kept my voice even. "Was that the first time?" He did not ask what I meant. That was answer enough to keep going. "The first time what?" "The first time you charged something for Jessica or her kids to Lucy's share." He was silent so long that I could hear the television in the background. Finally, he said, "She was going to lose her home." That sentence changed something for me because he still had not denied it. "Why charge Lucy? You know what Jessica was dealing with." That wasn't my question. "Morgan, she had 2 kids and nowhere secure to go. Why charge Lucy?" His voice sharpened. "Because you were doing fine." For a second, I could not speak. "Not Lucy. Meh." He had answered a question about my daughter's money by telling me I was
You
doing
just made an
fine.
enemy of this
I said,
family.
"Lucy
2
was
weeks
fine."
later, my
I
father
know how
emailed
old
me
she
a
was.
single
She had
paragraph
nothing to do with
informing me
Jessica's
I was
apartment.
no longer
You had a
welcome
steady
at family
job. You
gatherings
had
until
just
I
bought a house.
apologized for the
Lucy was
scene
safe.
at the hospital.
Jessica wasn't.
I did
So
not
you decided her share
apologize.
could absorb it.
I
That
started
was the
no
phrase from his
contact on a
spreadsheet,
Tuesday
and I
in
heard
early
his breathing
September of
change when I said it.
2023.
"Morgan,
What I
don't
did
twist
not
this.
know,
I'm using
what
your
nobody
words.
told me
I was
until
trying to
2.5
keep the
years
family afloat
later
by certifying
that
that
2
housing for
weeks
Jessica
after
was housing for Lucy. You make everything sound ugly when you say it like that. It sounds ugly because that's what happened. Raymond started talking about intent. He said nobody had been trying to hurt Lucy. He said they planned to balance things later. He said the trust had more than enough for all 3 children. Every explanation depended on the same belief, that because Lucy was secure, they had the right to decide what she could afford to lose. I asked him again, was that the first time? This time he answered, yes.
On a hospital
one
sketchpad.
word.
My ID badge
No
was. It
apology.
showed me sitting in a
No
chair. I had
excuse.
pulled my
Had
phone
to
out,
hide
only
it.
holding check the
I
time.
leaned against the
On the
kitchen
subject
counter
line
and
was
closed
my
my
mother's
eyes.
voice,
In
typed
her
in
own
lawyer
shaky
shaky
hand
handwriting.
started the
5
pattern.
words. Final
The camp
terms
had
for the
not
return
started
of
yet.
mom's
The
belongings.
laptop had not
Lily,
started
please
yet.
read in
The
full
first line
before
had been
responding.
crossed 3 years
I set the
earlier
cup
when
down
Jessica was
before I
scared.
read the first line.
Susan wanted
I
to
knew the
longer
cadence
say
of
did
her
not have
language,
enough
even in
cash,
print. She
and he
started
decided that
crying.
Lucy
She had been a
shared
Sunday
quietly
school
into the
teacher
phone
at
money
First
to
Baptist
said,
career
what
for
did Mom know?
22
I
Cielo.
asked. Raymond hesitated. You need to talk to her. That's not an answer. I'm not speaking for your mother. It was the safest thing he could say, and by then I had learned to pay attention when my father suddenly became careful. The next afternoon, Elaine emailed me again. Trust Counsel had finished reviewing the archived submission from 2023 and determined that the forwarded messages were part of the official reimbursement record because Raymond himself had included them when he silly-halved his mission. Sent the request to the Trust Administration mailbox. Certain unrelated details had been redacted, but the participants, timestamps, subject line, and messages relevant to the reimbursement remained intact. I opened the file slowly. The header showed Raymond as the sender to Atlantic Fiduciary Services. Beneath his message was the forwarded chain. The subject line read, Jessica, deposit, trust option. My pulse started beating harder before I even opened the body. There was Susan's name. There was Raymond's. The dates matched the week Jessica had been afraid of losing the apartment. I read the first visible line. Can we use Lucy's side this time? Jessica needs the deposit now. I stopped there, not because I was confused. Because for the first time since this began, I was looking at proof that my parents had discussed Lucy's share before they ever turned that decision into paperwork. I read the rest of the archived email thread the next morning, and whatever uncertainty I had left about whether my parents understood what they were doing disappeared within a few lines. The first message was Susan's. Can we use Lucy's side this time? Jessica needs the deposit now. Raymond had answered before forwarding the thread to the trust office. Only if we classify it as educational housing support. Don't put Jessica's name in the beneficiary line. Susan replied, Will Morgan see? Raymond's answer was short enough that I read it 3 times. Not unless she asks for detail. There was no confusion in those messages. No one had accidentally selected the wrong account. They had discussed whose money they wanted to use, how to describe the expense, and whether I would notice. I felt sick before I felt angry. My hands went cold, and I had to set the phone down because I realized I was gripping it hard enough to hurt. For weeks, I had been trying to understand how much Jessica knew, how much Susan directed, and whether Raymond had simply gone along with things to keep everyone happy. The email removed that last possibility. He had not been standing on the sidelines while Mom made decisions. He had been translating those decisions into language that would pass through the reimbursement process. He knew what the trust office needed to see. He knew what not to write. He knew I normally received only summary descriptions unless I specifically challenged a transaction, and he had counted on that. I saved the copy Elaine had provided to the folder where I was keeping everything related to the review, then backed away from my desk. My first impulse was to send the thread to Susan and Raymond with one sentence, asking how they planned to explain it. I didn't. By then I had learned that every time I confronted them before the record was complete, they adjusted their story. I was done helping them rehearse. I was also done sending emotional messages that could be turned into another family argument about tone. The documents could speak for themselves. Later that afternoon, Elaine arranged a call with one of the trust attorneys. He was careful to separate what the records seemed to show from what the trust company could actually do. Susan and Raymond's reimbursement authority could remain suspended while the review continued. Under the agreement they had signed, Atlantic Fiduciary Services could terminate that authority permanently if the certifications were found materially inaccurate. The trustee could also demand repayment for amounts that had been reimbursed on false certifications. What the trustee could not do was magically recover every questionable dollar, decide criminal liability, or force my parents to pay disputed amounts without a process if they chose to fight. So, some of it may never come back, I said. That's possible, Elaine answered. Especially older transactions where documentation is incomplete or the benefit can't be traced with enough confidence. I had expected that answer, but hearing it still frustrated me. $32,000 had been flagged in some way across several years, but not all $32,000 would necessarily be recoverable. Some records were stronger than others. The cruise was straightforward because Lucy had never boarded. The laptop had a matching serial number in Noah's possession. The housing reimbursement now had Jessica's lease and the archived email chain. Other entries were vague enough that they might remain suspicious without becoming legally clean repayment claims. I had spent the first days of the review imagining that the goal was to put every dollar back.
At the wedding, my mom texted
Also,
me.
they made
Smug
her
as
sign
ever.
something.
No
The
punctuation.
house deed.
Just her signature, dashed like a slap in the face, wrapped in formal tone. I didn't reply. I logged into my account, transferred the $6,500 honeymoon refund back to myself, and canceled the business class flights I booked under her name. No shouting, no drama. Just a quiet little click. By morning, I had 23 missed calls, but only one message.
The trustee should pursue repayment from the adults responsible for the charges that could be verified. I stared at those 3 lines for a long time because they were less dramatic than revenge fantasies and far more important. If I focused only on money already gone, I could still leave the same people in position to make the same decisions later. Then I added one more note underneath, mostly for myself. Mia and Noah were not going to lose things because of what the adults had done. I did not want Noah's laptop taken away. I did not want legitimate educational support for either child reduced as punishment. I did not want Jessica told to reimburse camp fees out of grocery money if she had not been the person who falsely certified the charge. Susan had spent years deciding which child could afford to lose something. I was not going to repeat that logic just because I finally had the power to push back. Susan called me that evening. Her voice was controlled at first, almost soothing, and I knew immediately she was trying a different approach. She told me she had heard that the trustee might ask for money back and asked whether I understood what that could mean for Jessica's children. I told her the adults who made false certifications were responsible for the consequences. Susan said Mia and Noah had already been through enough. She said Jessica was finally getting stable after the divorce, and I was threatening to unravel years of support because I wanted everything technically equal. You keep describing this like equality is the problem, I said. It is when you ignore need. Need doesn't give you permission to certify
Brenda
something
put the stamp
false.
back in her bag.
We helped children.
She walked out of the room without
one
saying a
child's
word.
share without her mother knowing.
My mother's face
Susan's
turned the
tone
color of
changed.
cooked beets.
You're so cold about
She
this.
stood up,
I almost
smoothed her
laughed
cardigan,
because the
picked
accusation
up the
was
folder,
familiar.
and motioned me into
When
the
I was
hallway
useful,
with 2
I was
fingers.
strong.
In the hallway, she did
When I
not raise her
refused to
voice.
absorb more,
My mother
was
never
cold.
raised her voice in public.
You asked whether I was going
She
to
leaned
stop
in
the
close
review.
enough that I could
said,
smell her morning
the
coffee.
answer is no.
You don't understand what we're
Evelyn would
trying to
never have
protect her
wanted
from.
family money used to tear the
From
family
what, Mom?
apart.
Bed at night.
That
I did
overly
not
formal
mention it
tone
because
she
she was a
used
good
when
daughter.
she
I did
wanted
not
to
say
sound
She did it
above
on
the
an
chaos
iPad
she
signed
often
into an
created,
Apple ID that
as though she
uploaded
were a
every
school
minute of
principal
footage
handing
to
down a
family
suspension,
iCloud drive
rather
she
than a
had
mother
never logged
cutting out
into
her
in
own
life.
son from a
The
family
review
She had hung a
milestone.
camera in
The
her
room
room,
felt unusually
and then she had
quiet,
pointed it
as if
at
the air
herself.
itself had
Susan
paused to
and
see
Sandra
what he would
texted
do
me
on
next.
telling me I was making a
But
mistake.
Ethan
I
didn't
wearing a
move.
camel trench
He
coat.
didn't
Next morning,
pace. He didn't
Elaine
write a
sent me
furious
formal
email or
notice
Want to
call
lose weight
anyone.
without losing muscle?
Instead,
Factor
he
got me
opened
there.
a blank
I
document
was
on
tired
his
of all the
laptop
cutting and bulking
and
cycles.
typed,
Every email she had ever sent all this time, same way. I thought you had
Lily.
it.
I did
Your
not
father
get
stayed on
access
my
to
phone,
everything
prayed
in
about
her
this
for
for
3
3
but
months.
because the statements
Where
directly
I
tied
told
to
her back what your
transactions
grandmother
charged to
left
Lucy's
for you.
share,
I told her about
Elaine
but
was
only
admitting
after
by
you
the
come about
relative
Juliet's
house.
essay,
Reading
face us
them was
about the
almost
letter
surreal.
Marlowe had
Susan
on
said
video.
Raymond had
3
handled the
months. She
financial
listened.
and
That was how
investigative
long my
details,
grandmother had been in
and
the
that
end.
she had
She
relied on
said,
his
I
understanding.
scrolled. What do you need me to do? 41
Raymond wrote
bullets.
that
I told her
Susan
I would
had
call
been
her
the
back. I
person
read them once
deciding
the way
which
they were
read
something
the lab
I had to
report
do for a
first,
patient. You
and
don't
that
know.
he followed
Evening
her
of March
direction when
says,
preparing requests.
drug-free
For
workplace,
years, their
random
defense had been
testing
unified.
in effect.
They were
I
helping
had passed
family.
my December
They were
screen
being
3
generous.
weeks earlier.
They were
I
doing what
called my old
responsible
church friend
parents and
Bethany on
grandparents did when
speakerphone
someone was
and asked her
struggling. The
gently
moment individual
what people were
responsibility
saying.
mattered,
She paused
that
for a long
story
time.
began to split.
She said,
Susan wanted to be
Patty
the
says
caring
you've
mother
been
who had
struggling
not
with
understood the
substances and
paperwork.
toxic influences.
Raymond wanted to be the
She says they've
administrator
had
who
to set
only
hard
carried out
boundaries to
Susan's
protect
decisions.
Mama.
Neither position matched
Substances
the email
and
chain
toxic
sitting in the trust
influence.
file. Susan had asked to use Lucy's share. Raymond had explained how to classify it. They had not been one innocent person misled by another. They had been two adults performing different parts of the same decision. I showed Jessica the relevant statements after confirming with Elaine that I could discuss the information directly involving the family transactions. Jessica read them quietly at my kitchen table. "They're blaming each other," she said. I told her that was exactly what it looked like. She asked whether that helped the review. I said I didn't know yet. What mattered to me was that their statements could now be compared with records created years before anyone knew there would be a dispute. Jessica looked down at the printed page. "Mom always said Dad didn't like getting involved. I believe that too. He likes looking uninvolved." That distinction landed harder than I expected. Raymond's whole role in our family had depended on appearing calmer than Susan. He rarely started the argument, so he looked reasonable. He rarely delivered the harshest line, so he looked kind. But the records showed that while Susan supplied the emotional justification, Raymond supplied the mechanism. He did not need to shout to have power. Elaine called later that day to schedule the formal review meeting. It would happen after the trustee finished organizing the flagged transactions, supporting records and responses from everyone involved. She explained that the meeting was not a courtroom and that nobody was going to deliver a verdict on the spot. The purpose was to put the records, certifications, and explanations side by side, clarify what each person admitted or disputed, and determine what administrative action the trustee could take under the trust and reimbursement agreement. I appreciated the warning. Part of me wanted a clean confrontation where every lie collapsed at once. Real processes were slower than that. Before we ended the call, Elaine asked whether I intended to bring a long statement. I told her I had started writing one. She suggested I keep my focus on the disputed transactions and the outcome I was asking for. "Let the documents establish the history," she said. I knew she was right. I did not need to explain every Christmas, every unequal birthday gift, every time I had been told Jessica needed more. The review was not there to decide whether my childhood had been fair. It was there to decide whether adults had falsely charged expenses to my daughter's trust share. Then Elaine paused. "There's one thing you should be prepared for," she said. "Their written statements are already inconsistent, and the archived emails put pressure on both versions." I asked what she meant. Her answer was calm, but I could hear the warning in it. "They may blame each other in the room." A few days before the formal review, I was sitting at my dining room table with 3 folders open in front of me when Lucy came in carrying a glass of water. I had been comparing dates, certifications, and reimbursement notes for so long that I almost answered her without looking up. She asked whether Grandma was going to have to give the money back. I told her some of it might be repaid and some might not, because the trust company had to separate the charges they could prove from the ones that were too old or too vague. I was halfway through explaining that future distributions would probably have more oversight when Lucy interrupted me. "If Grandma gives the money back, does that mean she'll love me again?" I stopped talking. I had spent weeks turning every problem into something I could organize, document, and fix. Lucy was asking a question that had nothing to do with accounting. I closed the folder. Then I moved the other 2 away from me and asked Lucy to sit beside me. I told her I did not know whether Grandma would change, and I was not going to promise something I could not control. I told her what happened at the cruise terminal was not proof that she was less lovable than Mia or Noah. Adults could make selfish, unfair decisions and still try to call those decisions love. Lucy looked down at her hands and asked whether she had to talk to Grandma if she did not want to. I said no. She could have space for as long as she needed. Then she asked if she could still talk to Mia. "Of course," I said. "Mia didn't do this." Lucy leaned against me for a moment, and I realized that protecting her did not mean replacing every bad experience with a better one. Sometimes it meant refusing to make her pretend she was fine before she actually was. That conversation changed the way I looked at the review. Until then, I had been thinking in terms of outcomes: terminated authority, repayment, independent verification. Those things still mattered, but they were tools, not the whole point. The point was that Lucy should never again have to wonder whether being more secure made her easier to hurt. I put the trust folders in my office for the rest of the evening and stayed off my phone until after she went to bed. The next afternoon, Jessica called me. She sounded tense and asked if I was alone. I told her yes. She said Mom had just texted her and asked whether she could forward the exchange. A minute later, the screenshots appeared on my phone. I read them in order. Susan had told Jessica that the review was getting out of hand and that she needed to make it clear Morgan had always understood that family resources were sometimes pooled. Jessica had answered that I had never known Lucy's share was being used that way. Susan responded, "You don't have to say it like that. Just tell them Morgan knew we helped where it was needed." Jessica refused. Susan's next message was blunt. "Then don't ask us for another $1 for the kids." I read that line twice. I did not imagine the conversation before Jessica sent it to me. I did not invent Susan's expression or Jessica's tone. All I knew was what the screenshots showed and what Jessica told me afterward. She said the threat made something finally clear to her. For years, Mom's help had felt unconditional because Jessica usually gave her what she wanted in return: access, agreement, gratitude, and silence. The first time Jessica refused to protect her version of events, the money became leverage immediately. "I'm going to tell Elaine exactly what I knew," Jessica said. "And what you didn't know." "Yes." I waited. Jessica added. "And I'm going to tell her I signed things without reading them because I didn't want to ask too many questions."
A part written by my mother.
That was the part I respected
I would
most.
have to find that one myself.
She was not trying
The
to
honor
reinvent
committee
herself
process
as
began on
another
March
victim
4th.
who had done nothing wrong.
I drafted
She
a
admitted
formal
that more
request
than
and
once
sent
she
it to
had
Marlo.
suspected there were details
I
she would
asked
not
the
like
committee
and
to
chose
compare
not
my
to look
submitted
because
personal
the
statement
benefits
from the
made her life easier.
2025 cycle
"You don't
with
have to do
Juliet's
it for
submitted
me,"
personal
I
statement
said.
from the
"I'm not."
2024 cycle.
Good. There was a
Specifically,
silence
the
between us
paragraphs
that felt different
referencing a
from the ones we
pediatric
had grown up
oncology
with.
patient.
Not
I
comfortable
attached
exactly,
my original
but
draft
honest.
document from spring
Jessica
2020.
said, "I think I need to know I can tell Mom no and still survive it. Then tell the truth for yourself." After we hung up, I opened the statement I had been preparing for the review. It was 9 pages long. The first version included nearly every grievance I could remember: birthdays, holidays, times Mom had helped Jessica and told me I would manage, times Dad had stayed silent and later called me privately to say Susan meant well. The writing was accurate, but as I read it again, I realized most of it did not belong in that room. The trust company was not there to decide which daughter had been loved properly. They were there to examine whether reimbursement certifications matched actual benefits and whether Susan and Raymond should keep authority over future requests. I deleted most of the statement. What remained fit on a little more than 1 page. The cruise reimbursement was disputed because Lucy never boarded. Several historical charges did not match where Lucy had been or what she had received. I asked that my parents' reimbursement authority be terminated, that future charges to Lucy's share require independent verification, and that verified improper reimbursements be pursued against the adults responsible. At the end, I added 1 sentence about Lucy. My daughter should never again have her financial protections treated as flexible because someone decides another child needs them more. That was enough. The morning of the review, I arrived early. Atlantic Fiduciary Services used a plain conference suite in a professional office building, not some dramatic courtroom. Jessica came in a few minutes after me. She had driven separately from Susan and Raymond and sat beside me without asking whether she should. I noticed Mom notice it. Her eyes went from Jessica to me and back again, but she said nothing. Dad stood near the window checking his phone, then slipped it into his pocket when Elaine entered. I did not try to guess what either of them was thinking. By that point, I had learned how dangerous it was to fill silence with conclusions. Susan finally said, "So this is what we're doing now? Sitting on sides?" Jessica answered before I could. "I'm sitting where I want." Mom's mouth tightened. Raymond stared at the table. I felt the old instinct to manage the room rise inside me. Make things smoother. Keep voices down. Prevent a scene. I let the instinct pass. I was not responsible for making the consequences comfortable. Elaine asked all of us to come into the conference room. There were printed packets at each seat, water bottles, a legal pad, and nothing else. One of the trust attorneys sat at the far end of the table. Elaine reminded everyone that the meeting was an administrative review, not a trial, and that they would go through the flagged transactions one by one, beginning with the clearest records. Susan folded her arms. Raymond asked whether they would be able to respond to each item. Elaine said yes. Jessica sat very still beside me. I placed my shortened statement in front of me and did not touch it. Elaine opened the first packet. We'll start with the cruise reimbursement charged to Lucy Ellis. Elaine began with the cruise because it was the simplest transaction to explain. The original reimbursement packet described a marine enrichment family package, and the charge against Lucy's share had been justified as part of that program. Susan and Raymond had been required to provide the more detailed booking records once the review expanded. Those records listed Mia and Noah for the youth workshops and excursions. Lucy's name was nowhere on them. Elaine placed the documents side by side and asked my mother one question. Did Lucy receive the benefit described in this reimbursement? Susan looked at the papers, then at me. Plans changed. Elaine repeated the question. Did Lucy receive the benefit? Susan finally said, no. Then Elaine displayed the text Susan had sent me at the terminal. They deserve this more. There was no booking accident left to argue about. Mom had known Lucy was excluded and had still allowed the expense to remain charged to her share. Susan immediately tried to move the conversation back to intention. She said Mia and Noah had needed the trip more, that family plans changed all the time, and that nobody had personally profited from taking children on a cruise. The trust attorney stopped her gently. The issue is not whether you believed another child had greater need. The issue is whether the beneficiary named in the certification received the benefit. Susan tightened her mouth, but said nothing. I watched her struggle with a system that did not care whether she thought her choice had been generous. Elaine moved to the science camp next. She showed the trust entry, the reimbursement documentation, and the dates. Then she showed the hotel confirmation and photographs, proving Lucy had been in Colorado with me during the entire week. There was no plausible way she could have attended the program in Florida. The laptop followed. The invoice serial number matched the device Noah was using. Jessica confirmed that Mom and Dad had presented it to her as something they had purchased for him. Then came the housing reimbursement from 2023. The original move-in statement was placed beside Jessica's full lease. Jessica was the tenant. Mia and Noah were the occupants. Lucy had never lived at that address. Raymond shifted in his chair. All of the children are family, he said. Nobody was taking money outside the family. The trust attorney answered before I could. The accounting shares were not structured as one pooled family account. Each beneficiary had a separate share. Raymond shook his head. But the purpose was to help the children. With accurate certifications, the attorney said. That was the point my parents kept trying to step around. They wanted generosity to erase ownership. They wanted the fact that Mia and Noah were relatives to make Lucy's share available whenever they decided another child needed something more. The trust documents did not work that way, and neither did the records. Then Elaine opened Raymond's spreadsheet. I watched his face change when he saw the file name projected on the monitor. He leaned forward and said, "That's a personal spreadsheet. It wasn't an official trust record." Elaine agreed. "It was provided voluntarily by you to Morgan, who forwarded the original file to us. We are not treating it as a trust record. We are comparing your personal notes with transactions already in the trust records." She highlighted several rows. Shift to M lessons, J emergency, then the phrase I had not been able to forget, le can absorbe. Elaine asked Raymond why his private notes repeatedly matched the same allocations now under review. He said the spreadsheet was only a rough way of tracking family support. She asked why a row charged to Lucy's share contained a note referring to Mia's lessons. He said he did not remember. She moved to another row. Same problem. Another. Same answer. Susan looked at him. "You told me that spreadsheet was just for balancing things later." Raymond turned toward her. "It was." "Then why didn't you balance them?" "I was trying to. You told me this was allowed." That was the first crack. Elaine did not interrupt. She opened the archived email from the first housing reimbursement and showed the header proving it had been preserved as part of Raymond's original submission. Then she read the relevant messages. Susan asking whether they could use Lucy's side because Jessica needed the deposit. Raymond explaining they would have to classify it as educational housing support and warning not to put Jessica's name in the beneficiary line. Susan asking whether I would see, Raymond replying that I probably would not, unless I asked for detail. The room went silent. Susan was the first to break it. She looked at Raymond and said, "You told me it was allowed." He stared at her. "You were the one who kept asking me to find money. You designed the forms. You spent the money." Susan's face went red. "Because you told me you knew how to do it. And you told me Jessica needed it." The language changed instantly. They were no longer talking about helping children. They were no longer talking about fairness. They were talking about who had asked, who had designed, who had submitted, who had benefited. The moral story they had repeated for weeks disappeared, the moment each of them realized the other might become the safer place to put blame. Jessica sat beside me with her hands folded tightly in her lap. When Elaine asked for her statement, she did not try to make herself innocent. She admitted signing electronic acknowledgments Raymond had sent her. She said that at first she did not understand which beneficiary share was being charged. Then she admitted something harder. Later, there were times when she suspected she did not want to know too much because the help was useful. She told the room she had chosen not to ask questions she should have asked. Susan interrupted. "Jessica, you knew we were helping your children." Jessica looked at her. "I knew you were helping us. I didn't know Lucy was paying for some of it. That's not fair." "No," Jessica said quietly. "It wasn't." Then she handed Elaine the text thread Susan had sent before the review, the one asking Jessica to say I had known about family pooling. Elaine read it, including Susan's final threat that Jessica should not ask them for another $1 if she refused. Jessica did not ask anyone to forgive her. She simply said she would not repeat something that was not true. By then, I barely needed the statement I had brought. Raymond turned toward me. His face looked exhausted more than angry. "Aren't you going to say something?" I looked at Susan, then at him. I had once imagined that if I ever got them into a room where the truth could not be redirected, I would have years of things to say. Instead, I closed the folder in front of me. "You already said enough." I told Elaine my requests had not changed. Susan and Raymond should permanently lose reimbursement authority. Future distributions from Lucy's share should require independent verification, and the trustee should seek repayment from the responsible adults for the transactions that could actually be verified without taking anything back from Mia or Noah. That was all. Elaine explained that the temporary suspension would remain in place while counsel completed the administrative findings. No one was ordered to pay anything that day. No one was threatened with arrest. Susan and Raymond would receive a written determination and would still have the right to contest any repayment demand. We left the room without the dramatic ending my parents probably expected from me. I did not yell, Jessica did not hug me, Susan did not apologize, Raymond did not suddenly understand what he had done. A few days later, an email from Atlantic Fiduciary Services appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, "Administrative Determination, Ellis Family Trust Review." I opened the administrative determination after Lucy had gone to school because I did not want her sitting beside me while I learned what adults had done with money that was supposed to be protected for her. The document was not dramatic. There were no threats, no criminal accusations, no language about anyone being ruined. It was a careful summary of what Atlantic Fiduciary Services had verified. Multiple reimbursements charged to Lucy's accounting share had not benefited Lucy. Susan and Raymond had materially participated in inaccurate beneficiary certifications. Their authority as family reimbursement coordinators was terminated permanently, and future distributions involving Lucy would require independent verification rather than relying on a family member's certification. The review had identified roughly $32,000 in questionable distributions, but only about $27,000 was supported strongly enough for the trustee to pursue repayment under the representative agreement my parents had signed. Most importantly to me, the determination stated clearly that Atlantic would not seek recovery from Mia or Noah for benefits they had received as children. The responsibility stayed with the adults who had made the decisions. I read the document twice before I let myself feel anything. For weeks, I had imagined that a formal result would bring some kind of release, but what I felt was quieter than that. The money mattered. $27,000 was not a rounding error, and I wanted every verified improper charge restored to Lucy's share. But the line that mattered most to me was the one ending my parents' reimbursement authority. They could no longer decide that Lucy was secure enough to absorb somebody else's emergency. They could no longer submit a form, choose a beneficiary line, and call their own judgment fairness. The system that had allowed them to turn favoritism into paperwork was closed. Trust Counsel sent Susan and Raymond a formal repayment demand under the agreement they had signed years earlier. They had the right to contest it. For a few days, I thought they might. Dad left Elaine messages challenging several transactions, and Mom insisted they had never intended to harm anyone. Then their own attorney apparently explained what a civil recovery dispute would involve if they refused to settle. The archived emails, the spreadsheet, the certifications, the lease, and the transaction history would all remain part of the evidence. By the beginning of the 6th week, they signed a written repayment agreement instead. Raymond took responsibility for most of the verified amount because he had initiated or certified.
At the time, it had seemed like a small favor, one of many. He clicked
The
cancel.
old one, Aunt Marianne,
The page
set up
processed
in
for a
2015.
moment before confirming the refund, $3,800 deposited back to his
Already on
account
it.
within 5 to 7
family
business
Apple
days.
ID had been
He
on
moved
Aunt
on to his
Marianne's
banking
phone
app,
before she died.
found the transfer
Raymond had
record
been
from
on
3
Walter's
weeks prior,
It had been on
$6,500 wired to
It had been on
Marilyn's
mine.
account,
He told
marked
me
My
that
as
mother
it
had
was
never
wedding
used
gift
it because
honeymoon
my mother
support.
believed
and that
He
might
reversed
sell the
it.
boat rather than pull too much from their investment account. I did not remind him how often he had talked about that boat as though it proved he had finally reached the comfortable stage of life he had worked for. I did not tell him selling it seemed appropriate. I simply listened until he said, "I hope you understand what this is costing us." "I understand exactly what it's costing," I said. "You could have stopped this before it got this far." I asked them to check the records. "You made the records." He went quiet. That was the last time I needed to explain the difference to him. Atlantic was not forcing him to sell his boat. I was not taking it. If he sold it, that was a financial choice he would make because the repayment agreement had consequences. For years, he had used the language of necessity to justify decisions about other people's resources. Now he was finally the person being told that wanting to keep something did not make someone else responsible for preserving it. Susan asked to meet me 2 days later. I chose a quiet cafe nowhere near either of our homes. I did not bring Lucy. Mom arrived already angry, though she tried to hide it behind the controlled expression she used whenever she wanted to look more reasonable than she felt. She sat down and asked whether I was happy now. I knew what answer she wanted. If I said yes, she could make the entire story about revenge. If I said no and tried to comfort her, she could make me responsible for her pain. "No," I said. "I'm finished." She stared at me. I told her I was finished arguing over whether Mia or Noah had needed more. I was finished debating whether I had earned enough to make Lucy's boundaries optional. I was finished letting every act of favoritism become a moral argument where Mom got to define compassion and everyone else had to accept her definition. She said Lucy would miss having a grandmother. I told her Lucy had asked for space, and I was respecting that. She said Jessica would come back when she needed help, because Jessica always did. I told her what Jessica chose was not mine to control. My job was to decide what was safe for me and my daughter. Then Susan used the last argument I had expected. "My mother would be ashamed of you." I had brought Evelyn's birthday card in my folder, though I had not decided whether I would use it. I took it out and placed it on the table between us. Mom recognized the handwriting before she read the sentence. "What is yours should always remain yours until you choose to give it." Susan's expression changed, but I did not wait for her to explain what Evelyn had supposedly meant. She knew the difference between giving and taking, I said. The card was not a legal document. It had never proved a single false reimbursement. It did not create the trust rules or determine repayment. But emotionally, it answered the argument my mother had used throughout the entire mess. Generosity was choosing to give away something that belonged to you. Susan and Raymond had chosen what Lucy could afford to lose, then called that generosity. Jessica and I were not suddenly close after the review. I would not have believed a reconciliation that easy even if I wanted one. She told me she had started rebuilding her budget without assuming Mom and Dad would cover whatever went wrong. She stopped accepting transfers she could not clearly identify. And she told Susan she was no longer allowed to arrange money, camps, or travel for Mia and Noah without Jessica seeing the paperwork herself. She also admitted that learning where the money came from had changed the way she understood years of being helped. Some of that help had been real. Some of it had been built on her willingness not to ask questions. When she told me she hoped I would trust her again someday, I answered honestly. Trust takes time. Jessica nodded and said she knew. That was enough for now. The children were easier. Lucy still talked to Mia. I made sure neither girl was turned into a messenger between adults. Noah kept his laptop. Mia did not lose lessons or programs because of what my parents had done. Atlantic continued administering the legitimate trust benefits for all 3 children under stricter verification. That mattered to me because I wanted the ending to prove something beyond the fact that I could fight back. My mother had justified taking from Lucy by deciding another child deserved more. If I had responded by trying to strip things from Mia and Noah, I would only have recreated her system with myself in charge. Near the end of August, I took Lucy to a coastal science center not far from home. It was not a replacement cruise, and I never presented it as one. We spent the afternoon looking at sea turtles, touching starfish in a supervised exhibit, and standing in front of a huge jellyfish tank where the water glowed blue under the lights. Lucy brought the cruise journal she had packed 6 weeks earlier. I thought she might tear out the pages she had labeled for the ship, but she didn't. She opened to one of them, sat on a bench, and started drawing jellyfish instead. When I asked if she wanted a new notebook, she looked at me like the idea made no sense.
During their courtship,
you
watched her die from a paragraph her mother handed to you in 1957. That before they married in 1958. That is a decision you made. There was the sapphire engagement ring she said, "You don't have to do this tomorrow." There was the Purple Heart he had earned outside Hughes City in 1968.
Jessica and I are learning how to have a
I
relationship.
saved the call. There was my family Bible from 11:18. My mother left my great-grandparents written 4 minutes.
I do not know whether my parents will ever
there was a
understand the
recipe. Listen to me. If you do this
or whether
tomorrow,
Lucy will want a relationship with them again someday. I no longer need to predict that. What changed is simpler. My daughter will not grow up under the rule I accepted for too long, that the stronger you are, the more other people are entitled to take from you. My parents thought the question was which grandchildren deserved more. In the end, they lost the right to decide. You should never confuse generosity with taking what belongs to someone else. Helping one family member does not justify hurting another, and being strong does not mean you should accept unfair treatment in silence. Protect your children, verify important financial decisions, and set boundaries when people repeatedly cross them. You can forgive mistakes without giving anyone unlimited access to your trust, money, or peace. Real love respects ownership, honesty, and consent. If this story reminded you to protect what matters and question unfair family patterns, subscribe to the channel for more stories about boundaries, accountability, and choosing yourself wisely.